friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith, and yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 224. Donna Evans is a wife, mother, grandmother, author, and conference speaker. Her life was enriched by raising her son, James Bruce, to adulthood, and she has much to share about both the challenges and blessings of parenting a child with special needs. When James Bruce was 5 years old, her husband challenged her to stop praying that God would make him normal and start praying for God to use him for his glory. Over time, she began to give her broken pieces to God, and when Brucie unexpectedly went to heaven in February of 2022, she experienced his faithfulness in completely new ways. I believe you'll be encouraged by what she has to share. Then be sure to come back next week as we continue our conversation about God's sovereignty in the midst of broken pieces. Hi, Donna. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Jill. It's nice to be with you today. Thank you for having me.
I've had the opportunity to personally meet nearly all the guests who have appeared on this podcast, but that's not the case with you. So I'm going to be learning about you right along with our listeners today. Let's get started by giving you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about yourself. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Well, I live in Birmingham, Alabama. Was born and raised in Birmingham, and except for 7 years when we moved to Sylacauga, a little town about an hour outside of Birmingham, when my husband was a head coach there, then we've lived in Birmingham all of our lives. And I'm married to my high school sweetheart, Bruce. We've been married for almost 49 years, and we have 4 adult children, one of whom's now with the Lord. And so I'm mom to them, and Mia, that's my grandmother name, to my 4 beautiful grandgirls, Julia, Caroline, Mary Clayton, and Bertie James. So we go to Briarwood Presbyterian Church, which is a PCA church here in Birmingham, where Bruce serves as an elder and I teach women's Bible studies. And for most of our marriage, I worked as a pharmacist at UAB Hospital, which is a large academic medical center. So I had a 43-year career there and retired 5 years ago to focus primarily on babies, books, and mentoring young moms. That's really where my heart is. So my goal whenever I speak, teach, or write is to encourage and equip, especially young moms, because I know and I remember how hard it was raising our 4 children. And so that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
All right. Very good. I'm looking forward to visiting with you today. I've just been looking forward to it ever since we scheduled it. So we're here today to talk specifically about the son that you said is with the Lord, your son, James Bruce. Mm-hmm. Take a few minutes and tell us about him. Help us get to know him a little bit.
Well, James Bruce was our 3rd child. Our 2nd child is a son, and he was named for both granddaddies. So when James Bruce was born, I just told my husband, if it's a boy, he's being named for you. So he's James Bruce Evans Jr., and that's how he would introduce himself. Hi, I'm James Bruce Evans Jr. He wouldn't just call himself James Bruce. That's what he did. He was pretty much, as an adult, a 175-pound functional 3-year-old. We realized when he was 2 months old, I realized something bad was wrong. I wasn't sure what it was, but he didn't maintain eye contact. He didn't smile, engage. And I kept asking the pediatrician, and the answer I got was, well, he's just a serious, sensitive child resistant to change. And then the pediatrician said, you've got 2 gifted kids. You just don't know what it's like to have a normal kid. And I went, I've got 2 normal kids, and whatever I've got's not normal. Sure. And it took us until he was 3 before we got a mild mental retardation, origin unknown. And That didn't give us a lot of answers, but there was a before the diagnosis and after the diagnosis, the 3 years that we had in that period waiting on somebody to tell us what was wrong, or what we were dealing with. That 3 years was real hard on our marriage because my husband thought I was obsessed with this child and wouldn't be
Mm.
satisfied until somebody said something's wrong.
Yeah.
So when he was 3, when he got his mild mental retardation, we had genetics done when he was 5, and it turned out he had an anomaly on chromosome 15, which they thought was responsible for neurological development. I didn't have it, and my husband didn't have it, so that was a good thing for our children and grandchildren because it wasn't something that could be passed down
Yeah.
through generations. He was 9 when he got autism as his primary diagnosis, and 18 when his seizures started. But the 9 and the autism really helped. Autism truly is like a puzzle piece, and when you put that in there with the mental retardation, it helped explain a lot of what we were dealing with him. But he was verbal, had good physical motor skills. His fine motor skills kind of maxed out at 23 months, so he couldn't read or write, but he could feed himself. He wound up being potty trained, rode his bike, those kinds of things. He absolutely loved music. He
Mm.
loved music. He and his dad, he couldn't carry on a decent conversation talking like we're talking now, but every night he and his dad listened to YouTube hymns, and he learned hundreds, and I mean hundreds of hymns, more verses than I ever learned growing up in a Southern Baptist church.
Yeah.
And he just had this incredible knack for timing on his music selections. We'd go to the beach and we'd get in the water with the waves, and he'd start singing, "Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, vast, unmeasured, boundless, free, like a mighty ocean rolling over me." He
Wow.
just had this knack. Or I'd be driving carpool in the afternoons, trying to get everybody where they were supposed to be with athletics or dance or piano, wherever it was. And after working and picking everybody up, I would be churning and burning, and he'd be singing "I Need Thee Every Hour" from the back seat. He lived close to God, and some days when I was churning and churning here in the house, fuming and fretting over things, as because there was never enough time, never enough energy, never enough money for all the therapies and all the other stuff that come with having a special needs kid. James Bruce would be walking around the house singing, "I worship you, I worship you. The reason I live is to worship you." So he
Wow.
lived close to God, and some things were more normal than not. He liked pretty girls. He never went up to the guys. He always went to the pretty girls. It could be the Walmart cashier. And I've learned early on, because he didn't have really good social filters. In fact, you might say he didn't have hardly any. He had hardly any social filters, and that's part of the autism too. I learned early on that if I could proactively say some things are more normal than not, he likes pretty girls. It didn't matter who it was; they liked being recognized. So
Sure. Hmm.
he was a challenge, and but our family is very different from having had him. So
Yeah.
he died when he was 38 years and 12 days old, had a massive seizure in his sleep, and went to be with the Lord, which, in some ways is, looking back on it, we just said, wouldn't all of us like to go to sleep at night in our own
Mm.
bed and wake up with the Lord?
Yeah.
That's what he did.
Hmm. Yeah. Talk about some of the joys of parenting a child or adult with special needs.
I think part of it was always seeing life through the eyes of a child.
Mm. Yeah.
Whether it was Christmas or Easter, James Bruce, we always did Advent devotionals every night during Advent season. And oh, he loved the music, and he loved the candles. He loved fighting with his brothers and sisters to rush to blow out the candles, that kind of stuff. And even as they grew up and moved off out of our home, even as they did that, we kept doing it because James Bruce loved the whole season. He
Sure.
celebrated Christmas and not just getting presents and stuff. But he was a real change agent, and that was another blessing. When he was 5, I was crying one day, and I cried a lot back then, and I was really mad at God over this was not what I planned for my life. And my husband came in and said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, the one that we named for you, this is the one that something's wrong with him." And my sweet husband just looked at me and he said, "Donna, if any of them needed my name, he's the one that needed it the most."
Yeah.
And I tell special needs moms all the time that's a great blessing for husbands, for families, for husbands who stay, because typical marriages wind up in divorce at least 50% of the time, or about 50% of the time. And for special needs and military marriages, the statistic is more like 90%, 85 to
Wow.
90%, because
Mm.
it's special needs is really hard on a family. But having said that, that particular day, Bruce really challenged me. He said, "You need to quit praying that God makes him normal and start praying that God uses him for his glory." And I just kind of threw it back in his face. I said, "How is God ever going to use this? He barely walks and talks, and he didn't get potty trained until he was 11." I said, "How is God ever going to use this?" And he said, "I don't know, but we're going to pray and we're going to trust him that he's going to use it." And so I started praying, but it wasn't, "Lord, use him for his glory." It was like, "Okay, Lord, show me what you're going to do." And
Mm.
boy, he really showed up and showed out, because James Bruce wound up being a change agent within our community, within our school system, within our church. He wound up, God used him. I told a lot of special needs parents in our church, you people need to thank God every day for James Bruce Evans Jr., because God really did use him in some amazing ways to start programs and kind of challenge the status quo. And I'll give you one example. In our
Sure.
particular school system, we're in a suburban school system that's fairly affluent, not because we're affluent, but because that's where my husband coached and worked.
Sure.
But at that particular time, the special needs kids were being aged out from middle school at 21. And, Proverbs 31, 8 and 9 says, "Speak up for the rights of the needy and for those who can't speak for themselves." And then the federal law says age appropriate.
Yeah.
So James Bruce had the great blessing of having a mama who had a voice. When he
That's right.
didn't, I did.
Hmm.
And anyhow, the high school now has 4 special needs classes where kids can age out at 21, and has some vocational programs and some other things that weren't available when he was there. And in fact, when James Bruce got diagnosed with autism when he was 9, the psychologist told me 4 in 10,000 were the statistics. And of course, now we know for boys, it's like 1 in 68. So it's been this explosion
Right.
of autism. Boys 5 to 1, boys to girls over the diagnosis. Nobody knows exactly why that is. But I will say that had the school not gone ahead and made preparations for those special needs classes, so they'd be in a real pickle now. And the same thing with our church ministry.
Hmm.
At the time he was 7, there was no special connections or special needs Sunday school program. We didn't have a place for our child to go to Sunday school. And so we were having to trade off taking care of him and not going to church as a family. And so we started teaching a 4-year-old class. And after a year of one of us watching James Bruce in that classroom and the other one teaching with 17 out of 19 boys and 4-year-olds,
Wow.
I went to our pastor and just said, the very church that would applaud our decision not to have an abortion with him, because we were advised to have an abortion and didn't. I said, the very church that would applaud that, the very church that says when he's baptized, we'll help you raise this child in the fear and admonition of the Lord, is the very church that's not even giving him Sunday school. Now,
Mm.
what are we going to do about that?
Yeah.
And Dr. Barker put his chin in his hands and raised up after about 5 seconds, and he said, "Well, we're going in." And Briarwood went in with great guns for Vacation Bible School and Sunday School in Camp Briarwood for Special Connections, and parent support groups and respite care, all of those things. And about 5 years ago, I guess, we hosted a national disability conference to train 450 churches on how to have disability ministries. So out of that seed from when James Bruce was 7, we've seen how God has blessed that ministry, and it's flourishing, at least in the PCA.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is.
What a need there is for that.
Yes, there is.
Mm, wow. What an impact you and James Bruce
Well,
had.
mainly James Bruce.
Yes, I love that. So, those are some of the joys or some of the blessings of parenting a special needs child or adult. What about the challenges?
It's hard, and
Yeah.
it's suffering, and there's no way. I love Elizabeth Elliot's definition of suffering is having what you don't want or wanting what you don't have.
Mm,
And I didn't want special needs, and yet I had it. And so, but looking back, I can see how God used that to shape and form our character, not just mine. I said a while ago, James Bruce was a change agent in so many ways, but the biggest way that he was a change agent is that God used him to change me.
mm,
And it changed the way we parented our other children, because before James Bruce, normal was never good enough. It had to be the best at piano, the best at athletics, the best at math team, the best, the best, the best. And with James Bruce, we realized his best was going to be a completely different standard. And so our challenge to our other children, or you people have been gifted and with a lot of good gifts, and you need to steward them, and you need to get out and get on your own as quickly as possible, because if you come back here, boomerang, if you come back here, you're going to have to help with him. And nobody came back. Everybody got out and got on their own. And
mhm.
so they got through college and grad school and jobs and moved off and came back, and those kinds of things. But we see them being very different, shaped very different. They all wound up with a compassion for the
Yes.
least and the last and the lost,
Yeah.
for the needy. And I was at a baseball game. My husband coached football and baseball, and I was at a baseball game one day, and this woman came up to me and she said, "Are you Miss Evans?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, she had tears in her eyes. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Well, I just want to tell you what your youngest son did at prom the other night." And I went, "Did he hurt somebody?" Or because she had tears. And she said,
Yeah.
"Oh, no." She said, "He came over and asked my daughter, who's special needs, if she'd like to have a picture made with
Mm,
him for
wow.
to her prom memory." And she said, "I just wanted to say that's really, really unusual. And we're so grateful for his kindness." And so I see that in all of my adult children. They wouldn't pat themselves on the back. They just think, well, that's the way. Because Brucie, we called him, even though his name was James Bruce, we called him Brucie most of the time around the house.
Mhm.
And they appreciated the Vestavia community, especially the athletics community. They just rallied when we were at ball games or at the ballpark. If I needed someone to help take him to the restroom, as he got bigger, and you're at lots and lots of ballparks, we just had a lot of helpers, people
Mm,
that really and truly helped, because it took a lot of help it took a community. And
sure.
that's why I think it changed a lot of other people too, not just
Yeah.
us. So, but it is hard. And as I said, what some of the challenges are, there's very seldom enough time, energy, or money to do all that needs to be done, because you're trying to help them become all that God created them to be. And then you're also grieving the child that you thought you were going to have. I think the psychologists call it chronic sorrow, where there's not really a light at the end of the tunnel. And always in the back of our minds was what's going to happen to him when something happens to us.
Right.
And I remember sitting in my room one day, he must have been in his 20s or so. And I will say that God provided everything we needed just as we needed it. It was kind of like
Mm.
manna, in literally manna in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Whether it was a day program or a residential program or the high school program, whatever it was never too soon. It was always like just in time.
Hmm.
And I remember being in my room that day and I'm thinking, there's no way this ends well. We either go first and somebody has to take care of him, or he goes first, and I don't know how we live with that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's just the reality of having a special needs. But what I tell people all the time, I just finished teaching. I'm on our church's womb to tomb life theology curriculum, and I just finished teaching a session on that to one of our Sunday school communities, and asking them what comes to your mind when you hear the term special needs. And of course, everybody thinks intellectual, but we had a little girl from an adjacent community, a 15-year-old, who just was in a shark attack and lost her arm and a leg. And all of a sudden, in 20 seconds, she becomes a special needs individual.
Sure.
And we have elder care and Alzheimer's and dementia. We have all sorts of other special needs. So there's all kinds of, I can see how advocating for intellectual disabilities with my child has broadened my horizon of other families that face special needs in
Yeah.
different situations. And still, what is the gospel and what does the Bible have to say about how we handle that and how we think about those things and how we minister to people?
That's right.
So I think that's one of the blessings, in addition to all the hardship. But I think the biggest thing about the hardship was it caused me to be desperate and dependent on God,
Mm.
in prayer and in His Word, and throughout the Psalms, just going throughout the Psalms, how the psalmist just cried out in anger and desperation and despair. And yet the biblical paradigm for that is that they were desperate, dependent, delivered, delighted. And
Mm.
that's, I think Sinclair Ferguson will say, we're desperate for God, we're dependent on God, we're delivered by God, and we're delighted in God. That you pay
Mm.
attention to the pronouns. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the nuts and bolts of where we were with him and his life. And he actually, I think he had a ministry.
Yeah, it sounds like he really did. I can see that his life has impacted a lot of people while he was here and continues to do so
Oh, yeah.
through you and the ministry that
Well,
you've
all of my
created.
speaking and teaching and writing has come out of James Bruce's life. I
Sure.
started, you mentioned the blog post. I started writing devotionals probably in 2004, not because of James Bruce, but
Right.
my husband's best friend had cancer, and he was a baseball coach, nationally acclaimed, and he thought he was dealing with indigestion, and he was given 6 weeks to live. And
Wow.
so I don't like spending time on the telephone, and I kept having all these parents asking me for daily updates, and we
Hmm.
didn't have Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff back in
Right.
2004.
Yeah.
And so, I started the little email devotion. I started the email updates for Coach Dunn. And out of that, after 6 weeks, he lasted 19 months. And out of that, it was only so many ways to say he's sick, he's dead, and he's dying, apart
Mm.
from a miracle. So I
Yeah.
just started putting a little short Bible verse from my quiet time up in there. And it turned into a devotional after he died because people asked me to keep doing it. And
Hmm.
at first I said, no, there's no reason to keep doing Coach Dunn updates. He's dead. And there was a local reporter, sports reporter, standing next to me that night. And he said, didn't you just say you were praying about your next thing, what God would have you do? And I said, yes. And he said, I think he just told you
Mm.
what you're supposed to be doing, and you just told him no. So that one thing led to another. And that's what we found with all of this, that as we in obedience, gather up our broken pieces and give them back to God, He gives us so much more than we could imagine.
That's right.
multiplies it.
That's right. That's right. Now, the morning that you got the news that James Bruce had passed away during the night, I know he was staying at a Christian group home, so he wasn't in your home when that happened. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, when we waited, we started the residential process
Hmm.
application. We looked around. We didn't like what we found locally, but there was one Christian group home that was about an hour outside of Birmingham that had a 30-year ministry a history by a couple who had their own special needs son and realized there was a need for long-term residential care.
Yeah.
And it was located on 640 acres, so I wasn't worried about him getting lost on a highway or something.
Yeah.
And we applied, and he was one of 50 applicants, and there were only 2 slots. And so we had a lot of people, our Sunday school class, our Hearts and Homes community. We just had people storming heaven, and he got one of the slots. Well, then COVID happened, and that shut things down until
Right.
after COVID. So we had another long waiting period. And after COVID, I looked at Bruce and just said, I can't do this anymore. We'd gone 14 months without anybody else coming into our home or taking him anywhere. All the day programs had shut down. And I am a real control freak where he was concerned, micromanaging everything like it was all on me. And
Sure.
even though God had given me a verse from Isaiah 45:3 about, in Isaiah, that said, "Ask me about the things to come concerning my sons, and you commit to me the work of my hands." So God claims ownership and responsibility for our children. And I just told Bruce after COVID in 14 months, I said, if he gets in and they open up the slot, we're going to move him. And if something happens, something happens. He's God's, and he was God's before he was ours, and he'll be God's after ours. But I never, ever imagined something would happen. We
Mm.
just mainly needed to move him because both of us decided we didn't want our children, our other children, to have to make decisions that we weren't willing to make about his care.
Right.
And so when he got in, we moved him up there. And the first 4 weeks was awful because we couldn't see him for that first 4 weeks. And then gradually, as things opened up, we could bring him home periodically. And what we realized when we brought him home was he was ready to go back. He actually liked it. We told him he was going to college. And so he had been there 11 months, and it hadn't been the most even stay there. There were some behavior issues and whether or not he was going to get to stay long term, but he'd been there 11 months. And Bruce and I had gone to the beach and been there one day and got up the next morning, and I had an email that said, "Call this number." And so I called this number and got a woman that I didn't know her name. I didn't know her title. I didn't know anything about her, but she just said, "Miss Evans." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "James Bruce is dead." And that's
Oh, wow.
exactly the way she said it. And I went, "My James Bruce." And she said, "Yes, ma'am." And I said, "My James Bruce." And she said, "Yes, ma'am. And the coroner has questions for you." And it just sent me reeling. But the thing that came to my mind was I've taught the Red Sea Rules principles that Robert J. Morgan wrote a little book in 2000 or 2004, sometime around in there, that's 10 God given strategies for dealing with adversity in your life. And it's my number one requested retreat in class topic. And Red Sea Rule number one is God knows where I am, and he means for me to be there. It's all from
Mm.
Exodus 13 through 15. And that was my very first thought, that God knows where I am and he means for me to be here. And then the second thought that came to my mind was just how grateful I was to have been his mom. So I asked the lady that was on the phone, I said, "Do you mind if I pray and just thank God for James Bruce's life?" And
Mm.
after we got through with that, she said, "I should have been the one praying for you. You were comforting me instead of me trying to comfort you." And she wound up coming to his memorial and talking to one of my sons. And, I think she felt really bad about the way it turned out that he was the only resident in 30 years that had ever died in his room in a group home. Everybody
Wow.
else that had died had either been sent out to their long-term care facility or had been in a hospital. And so, the thing about God knowing where I am and meaning for me to be there, it just goes back to God's sovereignty, that he
Mm.
reigns and he rules. And this took us by surprise, but it didn't take God by surprise.
Mhm.
And that was a huge piece of our comfort in the loss of James Bruce. Everybody handles grief differently. My husband and I were very different in our grief. At first, I was the one that was, you discipline your emotions, you do your next thing, you got to do what you got to do to get through the next few days, the next few months. And 4 months later, I was the one that was struggling with the grief, especially when that group home called and said the state had opened an investigation into his death after
Mm.
his death and realized there was a 6-week medication error, which really hit me hard because I spent 43 years of my career as a
Yeah.
pharmacist making sure people didn't die from medication errors. So,
Right.
it goes back to God's sovereign. He reigns
Mm.
and rules, and Brucey's days were ordained before there was one of them,
That's right.
and none of that caught God by surprise. But it did. It caught us by surprise, and my husband's grief at first was he was just inconsolable. And I do think a lot of that was because they had such a tight bond, and James
Sure.
Bruce just didn't leave a hole in our hearts. He left a hole in our schedule too, because we were
Mm.
so used to, even at our age, having 24/7, making sure he was taken care of.
Right.
Even with
Right.
residential, you didn't get away from the phone calls and the whatever else needed to be done for him.
This concludes the first half of my conversation with Donna Evans. Be sure to come back next week as we continue our conversation about God's sovereignty in the midst of our broken pieces. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.